Good morning, everybody. I'm going to try leaving the microphone, mine right here on the table, since I don't have a stand. Let me know if you can not hear me in the back. First of all, I want to welcome you to this forum and thank our legislators from Moorhead for being here. Thank you, gentlemen. The League of Women Voters sponsors this, of course. The League is a nonpartisan political organization, and it encourages informed and active participation in government. It works to increase understanding of major public policy issues and influences public policy through education and advocacy. So thanks to the League of Women Voters for hosting this event, for inviting me to participate. And thanks also to the Lake Agassiz Regional Library. This is a consolidated library system involving residents of Becker, Clay, Clearwater, Mahnomen, Norman, Polk, and Wilton counties, all in northwest Minnesota. LARL is composed of 13 branch libraries and 9 link sites, so thank you, library, for hosting this event for people to get to know their legislators and find out what's going on in St. Paul during this legislative session. My name is Charlie Johnson. I'm the president of the Fargo-Moorhead Convention and Visitors Bureau, and I appreciate being asked to help moderate these things from time to time. We're going to start by asking our legislators. I don't think I really need to introduce them. We have Senator Eakin and Representatives Marquardt and Lean here. Also, their names are right in front. Unless they sat in the wrong places, then we got a problem. But we're going to start by, again, thanking you for coming, gentlemen, and I'd like each of you to just give us a couple of minutes, not 10 minutes, but just a couple of minutes of what you see as the most important things at the top of your mind right now that are happening during this legislative session. Let's start here with Senator Eakin.
Well, thank you, Charlie, and I too would like to thank the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this event. I think it's very important for us to have this opportunity to be able to speak with our constituents and hear your concerns. We're going to be doing a lot of town meetings over this break. Actually, Paul and I are going to be doing a series of 12 town hall meetings coming up on Monday and Tuesday as well during what's called the break. But we're going to be doing a lot of work trying to gather information from our constituents. And we want to hear feedback from you as far as what's on your minds and what your priority issues are. In St. Paul, things have been moving very quickly. It's been a very compressed schedule, and quite frankly, I've never seen so much being done in such a short period of time. But we've already accomplished a great deal. All of the major bills have been passed, except we're still working on the bonding bill right now, which is going to be ramping up after in the Senate the week after we get back from break. But we have passed a significant tax relief, about $500 million in tax relief, much of which goes to middle-income people and in rural Minnesota, and we're going to see some real great benefits from that. Also, removing some business taxes, 3 of the business taxes that were repealed as a result of that. We also are making some new investments this year. We actually increased by 5% funding for long-term care providers who are providing care for people with disabilities and seniors in their homes under the waivered programs. That's a bill that I was carrying. I feel very strongly about that issue. These people have gone without pay increases for many years, and they are providing very important work, and their work is very hard and very important for our communities. So I think it's time that we recognize them and adequately compensate them for the hard and important work that they're doing. And there's also a real crisis in this industry as far as stability is concerned. Keeping good quality people in that line of work. One thing that people with disabilities and the seniors who rely on these services need is they need to have stability. Providers who stick with their job, who get to know these people, and many of them get to be like members of the family for them. So that's a very important issue. And there's a number of other issues as well. We've been able to do a lot more in terms of investment tax relief because the economy is heading in the right direction. We finally have gotten the economy back on track again so that we're putting more people back to work, and we see the unemployment rate at its lowest level since 2007. We have among the lowest unemployment rate in the nation, and we have the 5th fastest growing economy in the nation. And so more people working, more people making more money, and that's resulted in more resources for the state to work with as well, so that we can invest in this tax relief and invest in these critical parts of our budget, including long-term care for seniors and people with disabilities. The third major thing that we're going to be dealing with after we get back again is the bonding bill. My priority there is going to be flood mitigation, making sure that we're finishing up projects. They're nearing completion now. As you know, you don't get a whole lot of benefit out of these projects until that last piece is put in place, and we're getting close. So we want to finish up the flood mitigation projects here in Moorhead, in Oakport, and all up and down the Red River Valley. There's other bonding projects as well, of course. MSUM is looking at some asset preservation programs to just simply maintain buildings, a new boiler, fixing leaky roof, fixing wiring, replacing wiring for NEMSIC. Also, M-State, we're looking at expanding a diesel mechanic facility there, which is a growing part of our economy. Obviously, we're an ag-based economy, and I think that would be a real economic boon also. And there's many others. We also have, I'm also carrying a bill for expanding facility space for early childhood programs, Head Start programs. One of the unintended consequences of all-day, everyday kindergarten is that some of that space ended up pushing out some of the early childhood programs because they need more space for the all-day, everyday kindergarten. So those are a few of the things that I'm working on, waste transfer station in Becker County as well. So we have a lot of things moving on the bonding, in the bonding bill as well. So thank you all for coming.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Representative Marquardt.
Good morning. I was always taught in a library to whisper and keep quiet. And I see some librarians in the back, but I guess I'll talk a little louder. So, first of all, good morning, and thanks to the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this. And what a lovely setting right here in the library. And I have sat right in this area and read magazines in the past, and I have been quiet at that time, but I guess not today. The senators covered an awful lot, and really, we have some luxuries this year because of a couple things. First of all, the economy in Minnesota is really getting some good steam. And all the indicators are very positive that we're moving in the right direction economically in Minnesota, and that's been very reflective in the budget surplus that we have, about $1.2 billion. The other thing that allows us to have this luxury, besides our hardworking employers and employees that's given us this good economic climate, is that last year, when we did the budget, we made sure that we were actually going to do an honest, balanced budget, not just for this 2 years, but into the future. So it's not like we're coming back behind the 8 ball where we do one-time shifts and we just get through the 2 years and then we're in deficit the next year. We actually have a surplus well into the future. So that allows us to do some things with this $1.2 billion. And just briefly, the bottom line is, and this is what we set out to do last year, is to get the state going in the right direction and to help people, to help folks out in rural Minnesota. And, you know, a couple examples, just senior citizens and families, and lowering the property taxes. Our state had seen increases of $330 million a year on the average in the last 11 years in property tax increases. This year, they actually were down $10 million. Now, you might not think that's a huge thing, down $10 million, but compared to the $330 million average, that's huge. In rural Minnesota, homeowners, senior citizens on fixed incomes, saw their property taxes go up double. And this year, an average in rural Minnesota in the last 11 years went up $50 million. This year, it went down $30-some million in rural Minnesota. After businesses had gone up an average of $31 million. This year in rural Minnesota, property taxes down $11 million. So that's huge. Froze tuition rates for students. Invest in education all day kindergarten. So the bottom line is, how can you help folks in rural Minnesota around the state? And that's been primarily the game plan, and that's what we're continuing to do this year. And as we talk more, we'll have more time to talk about specifics. But thank you so much. Great to be here.
Representative Lane.
Well, thank you, Charlie, and thank you all for taking time out of your schedules and taking your Saturday morning to join us. This is really good to see so many folks out here, and certainly I do want to thank the League of Women Voters and the Moorhead Library for putting this on and hosting us here today. When I think back to the last couple months and the work we've been able to accomplish in a pretty short, compressed time. You know, it really is quite amazing. No, I certainly don't have as much reference as my colleagues here as to how fast the legislature is moving this year compared to other years. But just to think, within the first 2 weeks, we were able to pass legislation to provide more relief for the propane crisis, more relief for folks as we've been really having this very cold winter, passing the $3.5 million to give all kids on free and reduced price lunches, actually be able to get them their lunches so they're able to get through their day well fed and everything. And then moving into the two tax bills where we're really providing some serious, significant relief for both the income taxes for middle income and lower income folks, repealing the business-to-business taxes, but also continuing on the trend we started last session with property tax relief, putting in an increase for this year for the homestead and the renter's credits. Also, Representative Marquardt worked on a piece very significant for agricultural homestead property tax relief. So, you know, really the work is really progressing, and I'm you know, I'm very proud to be doing the work that we are doing in the legislature. In the last couple of weeks, passing the supplemental budget bill for the 5% increase, as Senator Eakin mentioned. Also getting a 1% increase on the general education formula. So, you know, I'm pretty confident we'll be able to continue this work with a really good bonding bill and provide some good projects for us here in the 4th District. So, again, I do appreciate you all coming out this morning.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. I have some questions to start with that have already been contributed by those of you in the audience. If you do have a question and have it written down on an index card, kind of raise your hand, and one of the League of Women Voters people will pick it up and bring it up to me. Okay, fellows, let's start with the, that was a little familiar, so I probably shouldn't call legislators fellas. Gentlemen? So, let's go down the line. This time we'll start on the far side with Representative Lean. Somebody would like to know how you voted on the minimum wage increase and why. Now, some of these questions I've got duplicates, and I'm trying to pick one that covers whatever nuance there was in each question. This one seems to cover everything. So, what did you vote on the minimum wage increase, and why did you do it?
I did vote to increase the minimum wage up to that $9.50 level. You know, I've been looking into this issue a lot in the last year since we took the vote last year in the House on it, and taking a look at what minimum wage will do for the lower income workers in terms of increasing their purchasing power and ultimately putting more money into the local economies, really improving their social mobility, hoping that they'll be able to get off of some of the social spending programs. I think everyone can really appreciate that. Also, I've looked into some information about other areas, other border cities, and what minimum wage has done. And there was a study, a pretty well-known study done between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, specifically looking at fast food workers. And when New Jersey had increased their minimum wage and Pennsylvania, you know, remained at a lower wage, the job growth in New Jersey actually increased more than the job growth in Pennsylvania. So there are the studies, there are the statistics to support that minimum wage does increase and does improve the local economies. And here we, of course, last year provided some significant dollars for the border city enterprise and development zones, and that's something that all three of us have actually continued the work on this year. There's a piece in the second tax bill we passed with the property tax relief that'll put $3 million into the border city programs starting in 2016 all the way going through 2019. So I think taking, you know, some of these things together, we are really continuing the strong work for our local economy here, and I think that we'll you know, see the results of that here as that border city program gets stronger.
Okay, Representative Marquardt.
Well, I did vote yes, and I think it's important that we try to race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. Our minimum wage in Minnesota is $6.15, even though for most practical purposes, most pay the $7.25, the federal wage. The last time the minimum wage was raised was 2005. In that time, the inflation's gone up 20%. So you take $7.25, that's $8.70. So why should the purchasing power of our folks out there who are working very hard actually be going down while the rest of the United States and the rest of Minnesota is seeing things for the better? And so I think it's important. A lot of times people think, well, this is just for people working at McDonald's. But the fact of the matter is that 23% of all those who would benefit from this minimum wage are the sole providers for their families. And if you take a single parent with one child working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, that person is working in poverty at the current minimum wage. In this great state of Minnesota, that simply should not be happening. Now, I understand the increased costs for businesses. That's a true concern. But what we also know is that folks who will be receiving this minimum wage, studies show, put those dollars immediately back into the economy because of the increased purchasing power. Also, this will help move people off of federal and state programs as their wages go up. Over 200,000 women will see a increase in wages. 350,000 Minnesotans will see an increase in purchasing power. So certainly, and especially when you're along the border, there's a balance here. But I think overall, this has been long overdue. The minimum wage is way below the purchasing power than it was in 2005. We need to continue to move that forward. And I think overall, it will positively impact our economy.
Senator?
And I also voted in favor of the minimum wage increase, and I agree that it was a long time coming. It's been a long time since they've received a minimum wage increase, as Paul said, back in 2005. It hasn't been keeping up with inflation, and we want to make work pay. We want to make work pay. If you want people to be working, you want to make sure that they're paid adequately to provide for their families and for themselves. And that's what this is about, and I think it's about quality as well. One of the reasons, and Representative Lean talked about the study that was being done. I think one of the reasons that you saw in that study that employment was actually increasing and the economy was actually growing in the state that did increase its minimum wage, New Jersey, I believe you said it was, that has increased it, is because you're attracting a lot more workers to your state because they want those better paying jobs. And so we're going to attract more people to Minnesota who want to work and who want to earn more, and you're going to have better quality services in my view, because obviously you get what you pay for, and if you have higher paid workers, you're probably going to have a higher quality workforce as well. And so I think that that's important to keep in mind as well. I think it's also important to keep in mind that we're phasing it in. It's not going in at $9.50 immediately. It's a 3-year period, so it's going to go up to $8 in August this year. It'll go up to, I believe it's starting 8, 9, and then $9.50 in 2016, in August of 2016. So it's not immediate, it's phased in. We understand that businesses do need to prepare, that they need to have some time to adjust, and that's why we did the phase in, and then of course indexed for inflation after that. But I do think it's important that we keep up with inflation and make sure that, that those that are working at the lower income jobs are being paid adequately to provide for their families. And if you make work pay, you're going to have more people working, in my view.
All right, thank you. Just one little follow-up here, and I'm sorry I got distracted when I was looking at some other questions, and maybe Representative Lean covered this, but Moorhead, I happen to be on the Moorhead Economic Development Authority, so I hear information from the city and what it's lobbying on through those things. There has been some effort in the last few years to change the way restaurant workers are paid so that they could be paid a lower minimum wage to take into account the tips. Basically, it's called tip credit. And Moorhead restaurants have argued that they're at a disadvantage to Fargo restaurants because they have to pay the full minimum wage. Realistically, would that ever be something that would go into a border cities thing? Whoever wants to. Ben, you want to take it?
Yeah, there was an amendment to the minimum wage bill offered last year that would put in this tiered wage for tipped employees, and I did vote for that tiered wage amendment. It did not become a part of the bill. It didn't become a part of the final bill either this year. I think there is the support for it. Folks would like to see, some sort of tiered wage mechanism in a minimum wage bill. Now that might be something that comes up for discussion next year, more so on the state level. But with the Border City program, something that we were able to get done so far this year, I mean, it hasn't completely become law yet until the tax bill is completely finished. But we have been able to make the Border City program stronger, as I referenced, from 2016 to 2019. We would see $3 million annually into that program if this were to become law. And then in 2015, it would be $1.5 million. So that would really improve and build upon what we were able to accomplish last year for the Border City program. We were able to also do some things in there to make it a little more flexible, to address different issues, different concerns that come up now, as well as looking into the future with North Dakota's economy really taking off, and as far as I can tell, as far as most folks can tell, really not seeing any slowing down with it. So we have been able to make some improvements to that Border City program. Now, from what I understand, just reading into the program, doing some research, there is flexibility for the city to do different things with that program based upon the needs of the community, and like I say, based upon different issues that come up, keeping that flexible. So from the state's perspective, although the tiered wage did not happen last year, this year it is a possibility it may come up again next year, but also just keeping that Border City program stronger, keeping it more flexible to address the challenges that we face as different issues come up, I think is really crucial as well.
Okay, anybody else want to address that? Or?
Sure. Well, I could just mention that I think that it's an intriguing idea that is worthy of consideration. The tiered wage, that's not the tip credit, which is just simply counting all tips as wages and counting that towards the minimum wage. I do not support that. And I haven't decided which way I would go on the tiered wage yet, but it's something that I think is worthy of consideration, as I said. So that's where they will be allowed to make over the minimum wage, but at a certain level, and I think that the proposal that was being made last year was probably $12 an hour, that at that point then the minimum wage would drop back to, I think, $7.75, which would be, or something like that was the proposal that was being made. It's something that I would consider. I haven't made a decision yet firmly on which way I would go on that, but I'm certainly open to the idea. As far as the issue of the competition in the border cities here, we're certainly sensitive to that, and Representative Lean did a great job of explaining some of the things that we've already done to address that issue directly through the border cities legislation, the enterprise zones, where we that program was basically alive in name only prior to last year, and we brought that program back to life again, and are now providing incentives for businesses to locate and to stay here in Moorhead. We also brought that the property taxes down through the disparity reduction credit, which tries to keep our property taxes competitive again with North Dakota's. So there is a recognition that there are unique problems and challenges that we face on the borders, but there are also some unique opportunities that we're facing on the border. And one of the things that Representative Lean and I are carrying this year is a bill for a study to be done on the impact of the oil boom in North Dakota on Minnesota's economy generally, and more specifically how it's affecting the border city communities, and how we can not only deal with some of the challenges, but to also take advantage of the opportunities that poses. So it's not just a challenge. There are opportunities that exist because of the oil boom as well. And so we're trying to get a study done that will steer us in the right direction on how to take advantage of those opportunities.
Okay, actually we had a question about that, so thank you for bringing that up. Paul, did you want to comment on
I don't
that?
need that.
Okay, all right. Yes, there was a question about the $150,000 study, so I think we covered that. We're getting several questions about the bonding bill. I'm going to try to take care of them all here, and so it's going to be a bear with me. The bonding bill that's in the House is $850,000. Has that passed the House? $850 million.
No, it hasn't passed.
It hasn't passed yet, but that's the size of it, plus $150 million in cash, and that includes $100 million for housing, right? For affordable housing. Okay. Well, that's what some of the audience thinks. So the question is, Some people suggest that there is a big shortage of affordable housing. I think that's probably true all over. So they want to thank you for supporting that $100 million that's in there. Is the Senate likely to keep that in place? Let's start with that question for Senator Egan. The housing, the $100 million for affordable housing.
Well, it really depends on what the overall size of the bonding bill is. And I've been an advocate for increasing the size of the bonding bill to at least maximize the amount that we've traditionally done in the past. Usually there's been kind of it's an unwritten rule, I guess, that we bond for about 3% as far as the servicing, 3% of the general fund budget for servicing the bonding debt. Now that was a rather arbitrary figure that was set back during Governor Perpich's administration. He was asked where he thought it should be, and he threw out that number 3%. For some reason, that became the standard by which we all operate now. And that's actually quite low compared to what other states do. Most economists, many economists around the country, believe that we underutilize the bonding tool here in Minnesota, that we could use it much more effectively if we had a larger bonding bill. So we're very frugal in how we use those bonding dollars, and in the past several years, we've actually not even come up to that 3% standard. It's been smaller than traditional bonding bills, and because of that, we've gotten a backlog of a lot of very worthy projects that are being proposed that have not been able to get funding. And for instance, this year we're going to have a bonding bill that's probably around $1 billion. We have over $4 billion worth of requests that are being made. And one of those requests is the $100 million for the low-income housing, affordable housing. And obviously that's a big part of that $1 billion. So that's the challenge that we have, is all of these different conflicting, competing requests that are being made. I think that we should be up at the 100 million mark. Again, the problem is, will the bonding bill be big enough to accommodate that and all of these other requests and needs that are being made too? For flood mitigation, for instance, to make sure that we're able to complete our flood mitigation projects.
And House members, you want to tackle this, the bonding bill and the $100 million?
Well, first the bonding bill, I mean, the bigger, the better, of course. I mean, we have the needs for all these projects. Interest rates are still low. Contractors are hungry. Bids are coming in good, and puts people to work. And besides doing flood mitigation in colleges and all these other things, more particular to the housing, that is a huge, huge concern. A lot of times people think that's a metro concern, affordable housing. It is a huge rural concern. I carried a bill a few years ago and learned a lot about that subject. And first of all, you have large industries out in rural Minnesota, in these smaller communities, that can't get workers because they don't have the housing for workers out in rural Minnesota. And then the other thing is, they usually say that about a breaking line is that you pay about 30% of your income in housing. There's a huge percent of homeowners that are paying much larger than that. So we really have a huge affordable housing concern, and it's one in Minnesota, in rural Minnesota. I'm hoping we can keep that $100 million in the bonding bill.
Representative Lane.
Yeah, I certainly am well aware of the local needs for housing. I know the vacancy rates below 3% right now in Moorhead, not just Fargo-Moorhead, but just Moorhead. I know it's a huge concern. I've sat down with, all three of us for that matter, have sat down with folks over at Gateway Gardens discussing this issue, talking about it with folks from Dorothy Day, with folks from Churches United, and I get the updates every month as far as the overflow from Churches United and how many folks and families were put into the different churches that volunteered to open up their space. So no, this is a huge concern, and I did sign on to that $100 million for the $100 million cash for housing projects around Minnesota. I'd also signed on to Representative Fabian's bill for the workforce housing out in greater Minnesota. So certainly am well aware of the need and certainly supportive, and looking at the issues to address, or looking at the solutions rather to address that. In terms of the bonding bill as a whole, I think $9.9 million was put in for flood mitigation on the House side, and that's for projects all around the state. There's a little discussion as to how different projects around the state would be funded at that $9.9 million. Now, in the language in the House bill, Moorhead and Montevideo specifically are named. So, from what I understand, based on the needs of Montevideo, Moorhead would get its flood project completed if that were to go through. Now, there's another conversation about how the DNR would allocate that $9.9 million, and based on that information, Moorhead would see about $4.5 million. So I think we do need to sit down still and figure out, okay, how is this money going to be allocated? I am confident, though, what Moorhead needs would get close to completed, if not completed here this year. As far as Oakport Township, I think we'd have to hit about the 25 million in order for Oakport to see any funding for its flood mitigation project. So I'm certainly supportive of a larger bonding bill. I think the requests across the state were about $3 billion, and Chair Hausman on the House side, her first bonding bill was $1.3 billion, so she had to pare that down considerably to get it out of her committee. But I've been talking with her, and talking about going larger on a bonding bill, and at different levels, different numbers, how much could go into flood mitigation, and then based on that, what projects around the state would get funded. So the conversation really is just starting on the bonding bill, and I know it'll be going all throughout the rest of the session. So there is a lot of work to be done, and still a lot of conversation to be had on that issue.
While we're still on the bonding bill, someone was asking if extension of the Heartland Trail, the Heartland Bicycle Trail, was still is in that bonding bill, or could be in the bonding bill.
Yeah, that's my bill, and it is in the $3.1 million from Frazee to Detroit Lakes is in the House bonding bill, and then there's some also planning money from Hawley to Moorhead for a trail.
Okay, that's good. You want to respond to that at all?
Well, just that I mentioned, I'm carrying it over on the Senate side, and so that is, I think it's important to note that we are the only region in the state of Minnesota that does not have a regional trail. So that's one of the reasons that we're looking at putting in this Heartland Trail, which is to extend all the way from Moorhead to Park Rapids. And there's a section of that trail that's ready to build right now. The land is already acquired and everything's ready to go. They even have a tunnel that's built under the highway that it's a tunnel to nowhere right now. But
Which section is this?
So this is the section between Detroit Lakes and Frazee.
Frazee, okay.
Yep, and so that's ready to go. That's shovel ready. And as Representative Marquardt said, that they would also do a study for planning for building a trail from Moorhead to Hawley. And just to mention about the trails, a lot of people think maybe it's just recreational, but actually it's a real economic benefit for the communities. Where these trails have been built, it's brought in a lot of money. So it's really an economic boon as well. And it also offers good health benefits for the community members. And just the fact that we don't have one in this region, I think that every region of the state deserves to be treated equally, I guess, and that we should have some of these same amenities. And just one last thing on the bonding bill. As far as the size of it, the bigger the bonding bill is, the better it is for our greater Minnesota communities, because it seems like when the bonding bill shrinks, it's projects in the rural areas that tend to fall off the table. So it's not to our benefit to see it shrink too much. And we're talking about basic infrastructure needs for the most part. Trails is a very, very small part of it. The bulk of it goes to roads and bridges, to our colleges and universities, and maintaining and improving on our buildings and facilities, and things like flood mitigation. That's what the bulk of the bonding bill goes towards, our basic infrastructure, which is so vital to our economic prosperity in Minnesota.
Okay, I think that's good enough of that. Okay. How do you feel about the anti-bullying law, which was signed by the governor, and what will our schools have to do to comply with that? Let's start with Representative Marquardt.
It was an interesting evening. Spent almost 12 hours debating that bill, and it's, the bottom line is it's going to make our schools safer, and we know schools or students that feel safer, feel more part of the school, they do better, and achievement goes up, and that improves our economy. The bottom line is that we had a bullying bill, 37 words long, and a lot of schools implementing this. In fact, they had to. Some doing an excellent job, some not doing such a great job. And what this bill will do is create a lot more consistency. And the idea is that, in the state of Minnesota, no parent should have to worry about their child not wanting to go to school because they're being picked on or bullied. And that's happening. And initially, last year when it was passed, I had concerns about it. And there's been a lot of misinformation on this, quite a lot of misinformation on this. But what it did is we narrowed the definition to bullying to mean that basically if what's happening materially and substantially interferes with their educational system, then that's bullying. It's not just some frivolous little thing. A lot of schools have concerns about costs. At one time there was annual training of staff. Now it's once every 3 years. That can be done during preschool in-service training. And then schools have to put one person in charge of the bullying. Schools right now hopefully have someone in charge of discipline. Shouldn't be a lot of extra costs there. But it does lay out various things that they have to develop a plan. The plan can be done locally. If you don't do a local one, you have to take the state one. I've heard parents don't get involved. Nothing could be further from the truth. As far as parental involvement or if something happens to either the actor or the target in a bullying incident, current law applies. And in fact, in this bill, it says there will be a presumption that parents will be notified. A lot of people are saying parents won't be notified. Well, it's in current law right now that parents are not always notified. There might be a certain situation where you don't want the parent to know because there's something that it may be worse at home than it is in the school. And that's current law. This bill didn't change that. In fact, this bill actually made it stronger that parents will be notified. There is no curriculum. There's been all sorts of statements that it's going to lead to this certain curriculum that is just awful. There are no requirements for any curriculum. And remember, Minnesota's a local control state, which means the only thing that goes into the classroom is what local school districts want to go into the classroom. So there's been a lot of misinformation. The bottom line is this is going to make schools safer and provide a more consistent policy dealing with students with bullying.
Okay, anybody else want to comment on that?
I think Paul did a great job of dispelling some of the myths and some of the misinformation that's been spread about this bill, and so I don't need to go into that, but I do think it's important to note that some of that misinformation was based on the first version that came out, and there were some very dramatic changes that were made to the bill before the final version was passed, and some of the misinformation was just information that was incorrect, even regarding the first version. But I think it's important to note that there's a lot of organizations that have come to support this bill, and that the authors of this bill did work with. They worked very closely with the schools to try to address many of the concerns they had with the first version. And because of that, you had Education Minnesota now that supports it, the Teachers Union. You have the Parent Teacher Association of Minnesota supporting it. You've got the Principals Association, the Secondary Principals Association, and the Elementary Principals Association supporting it. You got the Association of School Counselors for Minnesota supporting this. You have the Boy Scouts of Minnesota, the North Star Boy Scouts that support this. The ARC of Minnesota, which is an organization that represents the interests of people with disabilities, and also the Courage Center, which is for disabled children. They support it because children with disabilities are much more likely to be bullied than other children, more than twice as likely to be bullied. And I guess that's one thing that I felt quite strongly about. I had a brother, he's no longer with us, but he was mentally disabled, and so I thought about him when we were voting on this bill, and I thought, I felt a need that I have to stand up for those children who are being bullied, to make sure that we provide a safe, stable learning environment for our children, and that will provide, it obviously is a benefit for the whole state when we do that. And I think this sends a strong message. It's not onerous on the schools. It does require that there be a bullying policy in place, but I think that's the least that we should be doing to make sure, again, that we provide that stability for our students.
Okay, Representative Lee, you want to add anything?
Yeah. Real briefly, I had some concerns with the bill up until I was talking with the bill's author, Representative Dabney, and up until he had told me what Kent said, how the different associations of elementary, secondary principals, the school boards, the school administrators, superintendents, associations around the state all were able to get behind the bill after some changes were made on the Senate to the bill. So I think that really allayed a lot of concerns folks have. One other thing I would like to point out is that this bill really does focus on local control of how do we address this issue, how do we take care of this issue. And for any school that already has a policy in place to deal with bullying, you know, it's very likely that those policies are going to continue to be put in place as long as they meet the state requirements for this. And one more piece I'd like to add is that this bill really does encourage the community to get together and talk about and address and set a policy for this issue. It really encourages teachers, parents, students, you know, other staff and within the schools to put together a policy for this. So, you know, hearing a lot of those points made about the bill, you know, really allied my concerns and I think many other folks' concerns about the bill.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Let's move on to a different topic, which probably won't take as much time, but we want an answer from all three of you. Do you believe medical marijuana should be approved in Minnesota? Let's start with Representative Marquardt this time.
No, I don't. I understand there are medical concerns there, but I'm siding with law enforcement on this one. There's a lot of concerns about how do you control the access, how do you control the use, and I really think, and I've talked to law enforcement on this, that they think it's really a slippery slope. So certainly understand some of the medical needs there, but I just would vote no if that bill comes forward at this time.
Okay, Senator.
And I would support it. I do think that the issue of control of the substance, make sure that it's not, that there's no potential or limit the potential for any kind of abuse of legalizing it for medical purposes. But I do think that we can do that. I think that there are people who really do need this medication, and we do have other medications that are not legal to be used for recreational purposes, obviously, that are used for medical purposes, and I think this could be one of those. So I guess I understand some of the concerns that they have about control, but I do think that we need to make sure that it's tight enough to try to curtail any abuse that may occur. But I guess my concern is more with those who are suffering, especially those suffering from terminal illnesses. And we actually did pass a bill a few years ago in the legislature to legalize medical marijuana just for those that are terminally ill. And for instance, those who are having problems with nausea and not being able to hold down food because of treatments and things like that. And the medical marijuana has been demonstrated to be able to allow them to eat and to not feel sick all the time and nauseous. I think that it should be allowed for those purposes, especially, again, for those who are facing terminal illness, to make sure that in their last, months or their last weeks of life that they are able to have a higher quality of life. And so for that purpose, I would support it. I did support it then. Governor Pawlenty vetoed it at that time, so it did make it all the way through the legislature at that time. But it was a very tightly written bill, again, that only applied to those that were suffering from terminal illness.
Okay, Representative Lean.
I too would support this. I think the evidence is out there. I mean, we've seen 20 states plus the District of Columbia who authorize marijuana use for medicinal purposes. I think New York is soon to be the 21st state. So I think the science is out there. I think the evidence out there that does show for folks with certain conditions, this can really be a life-altering medicine for them. Also, I think the bill's author has really done quite a lot to address some of those concerns of access for folks who may use it for illicit recreational purposes. And of course, this bill would not allow for that at all. It would be only under doctor prescription and those types of things. But some of the things the author has done to control that is to allow only a certain number of the dispensaries where folks would be able to get medical marijuana, a certain number of dispensaries in each county based on population, and then allowing, folks who lived a great distance away from those dispensaries, to grow a limited number of plants in their home for their medicine. So, I don't know if this is really going to come up for a vote at all. There's been some talk about someone possibly offering an amendment for this on the Health and Human Service Policy Bill. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if the governor would sign a bill with medical marijuana in it. He may veto that aspect of it. But if it were to come up for a vote, I would vote for it.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Question here that is on the minds of lots of people around here. What's your opinion on the diversion as proposed by Fargo? This person suggests it's pitting Minnesota communities against each other. Comments on that? Let's start with Representative Lean this time.
Well, my focus on flood mitigation is finishing the project that we have started for Moorhead and for Oakport. We're about $7.2 million away from being completely protected up to 42.5 feet in Moorhead, about $5.2 million away for Oakport. So that's my first and foremost priority, my first focus. And not only will this result in, of course, the flood the flood protection, and in my mind, a real incentive for folks to move to Moorhead, to open businesses in Moorhead, but it would also allow us to apply to FEMA to bring our flood insurance rates down. So there are many reasons why we need to finish this project as soon as possible. In terms of the diversion, the DNR, their environmental impact study, will be out in later this year, I believe at the end of this year. And, so I think before we start really talking about, okay, what's Minnesota going to do with the diversion, I think we do need to allow the DNR to come out, complete their study, take a look at what the benefit would be for Minnesota, and from there, start having that conversation about appropriations and things.
Hasn't the DNR been involved in this somewhat, though, from the beginning?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, they must be aware of it.
Yeah, they have been involved with this, but that environmental impact study is going to be the final determination as to say, okay, this is the benefit for Minnesota, this is the benefit for North Dakota, and then from there, how much of the cost responsibility Minnesota would have.
Okay. Paul?
Well, I'm opposed to any state funding, especially at this point, and for a couple of the reasons that Representative Lean just mentioned. One is we need in Minnesota to finish these flood mitigation projects up and down the Red River Valley. So there's, Ada and Moorhead and everywhere in between, and we need to finish those up first. Second, the Department of Natural Resources is doing the environmental impact study. That's probably going to be done towards the end of the year. That's a very important study. And also very important is I'm very concerned about the impact on the upstream communities like Comstock and Wolverton, when they're going to be having basically kind of a flood wall there that's going to hold back water. I still don't feel that the Diversion Authority has properly looked at all of the options on that. I think there's a lot more discussion that has to be had on that. So as of right now, and I don't see any funding in the next few years for sure, coming for that project as we finish off our own projects up here along the Red River Valley, and then also to address those concerns upstream in Minnesota.
Senator?
Yeah, and I would agree with both Representatives Marquardt and Lean that we need to focus right now our efforts on completing the flood mitigation projects that we currently have to finish up here. And to button those things up, I think it's a little premature right now to be discussing what the state of Minnesota may be doing in regard to the diversion. I agree with Representative Marquardt that I think that all of the options need to be looked at, and I think that we need to take a comprehensive approach and make sure that we're considering the concerns of those both upstream and downstream, as well as those in Fargo-Moorhead itself. So we need to make sure that that river isn't a dividing point for us. That river should be something that brings us together. And I've always noticed during flooding situations that it doesn't seem to matter which side of the river you come from or what community you're from. Everybody pulled together to fight to protect their homes and their businesses and their communities from the devastation of the flooding. And I'm hoping that this river continues to be a source of unification and not a division between our communities.
Well, speaking of that division possibility, I mean, do any of you foresee a time, depending on what the DNR says, if they decided there wasn't any particular benefit from the diversion project and perhaps there was harm to Minnesota, do you ever foresee the possibility that Minnesota would actually oppose the project?
Well, I think that, we'll see what the DNR comes up with, but obviously if it does harm to Minnesota, yeah, I think you could see Minnesota not support the diversion. But we don't know what that study is going to indicate, and I certainly don't think that we should be paying any more as a state than what we get in benefits from the diversion. I think that that's part of the assessment process too, to make sure that we're not paying any more than what is our fair share in any contributions to the diversion.
Representatives, you want to add anything along those lines?
The purpose of the DNR doing that study is to see what impacts there would be on Minnesota. And if they come out that it's detrimental, they're acting in the behalf of the state of Minnesota. And also, again, with the concerns upstream, certainly number one, there would be no funding, but certainly a number two option could be to outright oppose the diversion. But I think that would be down the road to see what would happen with not only the study, but see if new options for upstream are developed.
And tell us again, what's the timetable on that DNR study?
Well, what I've heard is it takes about a year to do the study, and I think it might be later. I mean, we're maybe talking November, December of this year before that study would be complete.
Okay, all right. Okay, how about state parks? How about funding for state parks? It's a fairly general question. I pretty much read it the way it is. How's funding for state parks coming along? Are you going to be able to adequately fund them this year? Senator, you can start this one.
Sure, and of course, a lot of the funding for the state parks does come through the bonding bill, and again, a lot hinges on what the overall size of the bonding bill is. And again, the bonding bill is more for the basic infrastructure of our state, but state parks is certainly a part of that, and then there's funding through other means as well. For our state parks, and the state parks do raise money as well. They're a money-making operation. Although I think it's important to note that not all state parks are holding their own, so they are being subsidized not just from the state generally, but from other state parks that are making money. The biggest money maker is Itasca State Park, which isn't very far from us here, and actually it's the second state park in the United States. The first is Niagara Falls State Park, which is in New York State.
You mean as far as generating revenue?
No, as far as the age of the state park, it's the oldest. It was the first or the second state park in the United States. And it is the biggest moneymaker, though, in Minnesota by far. And a lot of the money that's being made there, they make well over what's necessary to run their operations. So they're pretty much self-sufficient. Well, they're self-sufficient, and they provide more money for the other state parks that may not. The Buffalo River State Park, for instance, but these are important amenities to have for the people of Minnesota. And I believe that the goal was to make sure that every person in the state of Minnesota would be within about 50 miles of a state park so that they can enjoy the great outdoors and have these amenities in our area. So they are an important part of our quality of life here in Minnesota. I think we need to make sure that we adequately fund them. And we have a lot of them, and I think that it has added a lot to our quality of life.
Okay, gentlemen.
Well, just adding on what Senator Ekin just said, I mean, the parks are very important for our tourism, our economy, and look at Buffalo River State Park. They have just a beautiful swimming facility, and I know a lot of people use that, Charlie, because when the government shut down in 2011. It shut down July 1st, and I received a lot of calls. And people said that the park was closed. So it's very important to the area, and whatever funding we have, I certainly strongly support that.
Representative Lean, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think we do need to keep in mind that in terms of greater Minnesota economy and tourism, the state parks play into that incredibly. So not just providing for the recreational enjoyment of folks, we do need to we do need to support our state parks, and we do need to support funding and keeping them up to date and keeping them maintained because, like I say, it's not just for the recreational enjoyment of folks. It is a significant part of greater Minnesota's economy.
Okay, we have a question here about a health-related issue. Where do you stand on e-cigarettes, and where do you stand on adding them to the Freedom to Breathe legislation? Representative Lean?
We heard a bill on e-cigarettes in the Government Operations Committee, and a couple amendments were added to the bill to ban them from any state buildings in Minnesota. This bill also, the meat of the bill, I guess you could say, touched on more so tighter restrictions, tighter regulations on allowing kids to access e-cigarettes. So, tighter laws for youth possession, for sales to youth, tighter laws and more restrictions, or I should say, outright banning them from schools and school grounds, some of those things. The bill did stop short, the amendments did stop short of the Complete Clean Indoor Air Act. If that were to come up, I would support that, banning the e-cigarettes from any places where traditional smoking products are banned. So that's kind of where that bill is now, and I believe that would be included in the Health and Human Service Policy Bill.
Paul?
Yeah, and I also support banning e-cigarettes in any areas where cigarettes are currently banned.
Okay. Senator?
Yeah, and same thing for me. I also support banning it, and it seems that there's a lot of unanswered questions about the health risks associated with e-cigarettes as well. So.
Okay. I have a question about energy and green energy, so to speak. Moorhead Public Service announced last week a new hydroelectric resource. It's about 3 times the cost of traditional resources, but it is 100% renewable. It will result in modest Moorhead Public Service rate increases, I think, as will a lot of alternative energy positions. So as you debate new energy legislation, how sensitive and aware are all of you fellows about the upward pressure that environmentally friendly resources put on costs and rates?
And I think I'm very sensitive to that, and I think that we need to be looking at both the economic as well as environmental impact of the policies that we're promoting in St. Paul. And as far as renewable energy sources, I do want to see us developing more renewable energy sources here in Minnesota. But I do believe we should do it more through incentives than through mandates. I think that the carrot approach works much better than the stick. And so I have concerns about the mandate approach pushing up costs, for instance, in a way that could be harmful to businesses or to the economy. I think we need to move in that direction of renewable energy sources, but we need to do it in a way that's efficient, that's effective, that doesn't create a backlash. And for some of my friends who are more of the mindset that they should just think of the environmental impact and want to just push ahead with mandates regardless of what the economic impact may be, I've told them that could be a real backlash to your movement in the long run, that it could be a real black eye to the renewable energy industry if it's perceived of as creating these great economic harm. So I told them that it's in their best interest as well to make sure that they're thinking about the economic impact as well when we move forward.
Paul?
There certainly has to be a balance. Minnesota has been a leader in renewable resources. We're the first state to mandate ethanol, first state to mandate 2% diesel. That's great for our economy, and it's great for our ag industry. We're also wind power and solar power now coming into being. But we know that we still need to rely on the coal and other based energy just as part of the whole mix. And the state, we've been moving more and more towards the renewables, which is good. But the balance is we have to make sure that we're looking at the price to the consumer also, and how can the utilities and the power companies do that. So Minnesota's been a leader on renewables, but at the same time, we have to have a balance to keep our prices, which are relatively low for power and energy sources here in Minnesota. We have to keep those prices down.
Ben?
Well, I heard my two colleagues both use the word balance, and I really do think that's how you do have to approach this issue and have to approach this conversation. I certainly am a supporter of more research, getting more clean energy into our economy, but we do have to take a balanced approach. I think too often this conversation becomes one or the other, and we do need to continue to use the traditional fossil fuel, coal-based sources of energy. But I do think just for the standpoint of our economy, from the standpoint of our environment, we do have to start looking at how can we integrate more clean, more renewable sources of energy into our, into our lives. I know the state did go pretty far last year in terms of a pretty big push for more renewable energy, and from my perspective, I think it's time to let some of those finish lines, some of those dates where we have to have a certain percentage of clean energy by this date. I think we need to let some of these policies take effect in order for us to really gauge where we are and what are some of these policies doing for our economy. I was pleased to see the co-ops in municipal power companies, power supplies, exempt from the bill, and I think that's really a proof positive that we do have to take a balanced approach, and we do have to recognize what some of the impacts clean sources of energy are to our economy. So I think we do have to continue looking at it and continue integrating it, but take that balanced approach and recognize that we do continue to to be using oil and coal and some of those things in our energy economy.
Okay, thank you. How do you feel, the three of you, about raising income limits to qualify for the homeowner credit refund? I'm probably talking about property tax credit, right? Paul, you want to start that? Or go ahead, Ben, whatever.
Something I'd like to take a look at is actually seeing if we can reintroduce the some of the aspects of the homestead credit program into the property tax refund program. And when I say that, maybe taking a look at, I know the homestead credit program really relied on the value of the home. And so I think, we can really take a look at both of these programs together and look at providing more relief for property taxpayers through a mechanism like that.
Okay, Paul?
I think if I'm understanding the question, it's referring to the homestead credit refund. And for the homeowner that maxes out at about an income of $103,000, you don't get much at that, but it phases out there. And I think for renters, it's around $50,000, but I think we're upping that a little bit closer to $60,000 this year. But that's a great point here. Last year, we reinstated the homestead credit in the form of a refund. And basically, the way to think about this, if your property taxes are more than 2% of your income, you probably qualify. And what we're trying to do is primarily for those folks who have high property taxes in comparison to their incomes, especially helping seniors and others, this provides a property tax relief. And this was a very important component of lowering property taxes this year. It really was. And so we have really ramped that up the last couple years, and we probably have a very progressive system, probably one of the best in the nation. But also this year, we are actually adding a little bit more to that even this year. But the income limits automatically go up with inflation a little bit every year anyway. So I think hopefully I addressed that.
Okay, Senator?
And I feel that that this is a good program, the refund program for which was previously known as the homestead credit here. We need to address the regressive nature of the property tax in Minnesota, and the property taxes just generally are the most regressive tax there is, which means that as your income levels go down, the rate you pay in taxes goes up. That's what regressive means, and that to me is not a fair tax system. And so it's one of the reasons that I think that we need to do all we can to just lower property taxes generally. And in my view, even phase them out. Although it's part of that three-legged stool. There's three main sources of taxes here in Minnesota. You've got the sales tax, the income tax, and the property tax. The one benefit of property taxes, and the only benefit, as I see it, is that it's more stable. And the reason it's more stable is because whether the economy is doing good or not, and whether your business is doing good or not, you still have to pay the property tax on it, which is one of the reasons it's so regressive. And one of the reasons I think that needs to be addressed through programs like this, and trying to make sure that that the regressivity of it is limited. And so I think that that's important to keep in mind as we move forward developing tax policy. And just one last thing on the property taxes generally, and Representative Marquardt and I believe Lean have both talked about this, that property taxes have gone down for the first time in over a decade in the state of Minnesota because of policies that we implemented last year. We are trying to seek out a fair tax system that doesn't hit lower and middle income people in rural Minnesota so hard. And the property tax does hit rural Minnesota much harder than other areas. So the property tax increases that we've seen over the last decade, which was the average again, 330 million a year, that was hitting rural Minnesota disproportionately. It was higher than that here in the rural Minnesota area. So we need to continue working on that to try to get us back more to where we used to be, a tax system that doesn't place so much burden on lower and middle income people in rural Minnesota.
Wait, are you saying you would support, for instance, replacing at least part of the property tax with an increased sales tax? I mean, there aren't that many options.
Yeah, you're right, Charlie. There's not a lot of options. I talked about the three-legged stool, so it's basically the two other options that are available. And one of the things that we did do was we did replace some of the property tax increases that we've been seeing over the last several years, and with an income tax increase that we implemented last year. And that was on incomes that are over $250,000 a year. So it's the first $250,000 that a person earns, there was no income tax increase on. But anything you earn over $250,000 in a year, and that, by the way, is after deductions, you would have to pay an increased tax on. And that's one of the reasons that we received the property tax relief that we did this last year.
Okay. All right. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Okay. I'm not familiar with this, so I'm basing some of these questions to make statements that I don't know. I haven't researched them. But apparently Kansas passed constitutional carry legislation. I assume this has to do with firearms, right? Where the state overrides local gun laws. Is there any interest in changing Minnesota's gun laws? Let's just do it that way.
Back, I don't know, about 10 years ago, we passed a conceal and carry permit, which really did replace local authority. It's where the state came in and said, if a person meets all these requirements, you shall issue the permit. So I don't see how that would differ too much from what Kansas just did. Now, maybe someone in the audience knows a lot more about that, but we had a so a sheriff can't just say yes or no. If they meet all these certain requirements, they shall issue the permit.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
So
anybody else want to comment on that?
So I think it would be.
It's fine the way it is? Okay.
I think so.
Okay, we're getting close to running out of time here. There's one more thing I still like to talk about taxes, don't we all? Do we anticipate any, you've already passed some tax relief this year, do you anticipate any more tax relief coming up this year for people?
We do, and we had the first tax bill, which repealed some of the business-to-business taxes that were passed last year, and then also did some federal conformity for middle-class tax relief. We now have a tax bill cut 2 bill coming through that will provide about $50 million in property tax relief, and about $19 million of it is for farmers. And while we've been up here talking about these property tax decreases, the one area that didn't see the decrease was the ag land, where because of about a 25% value increase, property taxes around the state went up on ag land about 12%. And actually, if you talk about some of the areas around here, even more than that. And so we do have some funding for this year
that would help buy that down by about $230, and then into the future on ramping up the agricultural homestead credit. So that is in there, and then there is some other business tax relief on some various items in the tax bill. So we're looking at both bills that have been passed from the House and Senate on Tax Bill 2, both had about $100 million of additional cuts. So when you look at that $1.2 billion deficit, when all is kind of said and done, about 60 to 65% of that budget surplus that we had, did I say deficit this second? Surplus that we have, is actually going into tax cuts or into reserves, and probably about a third of it into new investments. So I think it's a good balance of how we're using those dollars.
Okay, anybody else want to comment on that? Senator?
Well, I guess I just thought I'd mention again on the issue of the taxes, property taxes. Representative Marquardt mentioned that obviously not everybody's seeing reductions in property taxes based on who you are, and a lot of farmers have been seeing it increase because of the increasing land values. One of the downsides too, again, to the property tax system, and of course, there's a lag time behind one of the reasons that property values are going so high for farmers is because the economy's been doing well. But last year it didn't do so well. And there's some who are concerned that maybe it won't do as well in the future, but those land values will probably still be increasing for a period of time here, or staying high. And the downturn in a farm economy won't be reflected immediately. And so that's one of the reasons where I think it is important to seek some kind of property tax relief for them. I think that there should actually be some kind of a limit placed on how much anyone's taxes, property taxes, can go up in any one year, because some have seen some pretty outrageous increases as a result of their land values going up. And so again, that's one of the downsides of the property tax. The biggest downside, though, is that they do tend to hit our area harder because we don't have the property tax base or the population base, so we have to raise our property taxes higher and faster than anywhere else in the state to make up for a lot of the cuts that we've seen over the last decade, which is why we've seen them go up so dramatically in this area of the state. And one other thing on the income tax that we use to replace a lot of those property taxes with is that, again, it only applied to incomes above $250,000. That tended to impact the metro area much more than it did our area. There's a lot more people in the metro area who are receiving over $250,000 a year than there are in the rural areas. And believe me, there were some in the metro area in the legislature who were thinking that we really got a good deal in rural Minnesota and greater Minnesota last year, and we heard about it. And our response to them was, well, you had a pretty good deal for the last decade of pushing the tax burdens more and more onto property taxes and onto rural Minnesotans and onto middle and lower income people.
Okay, Representative Lee?
Yeah, I think Senator Eakin and Representative Marquardt pretty much hit it on the head, really touching on all the finer points. I personally do really appreciate the focus we've put on property tax relief. As Senator Eakin said, it's a very regressive tax, and it really doesn't take into consideration swings in your income or swings in your business income. So I think in terms of tax relief that really hits the pockets of most Minnesotans, certainly middle-class Minnesotans, property tax relief really is a way to provide that good relief. But just talking a little bit as a whole in terms of what the legislature has done for Minnesota in the last couple of years, Representative Marquardt and I actually sat down a couple times, and we're looking at really what are some of the monies coming in to Moorhead, specifically through some of the higher education, the tuition freeze, some of the K-12 funding, some of the K-12 levy reductions and levy relief, some of the local government aid, and some of these things. And it comes out to about over $15,600,000 coming into Clay County over the last, really in 2013 alone. So if you were to break that down per capita, that's roughly $411 for every individual, man, woman, and child, every individual for Moorhead coming into the state. Now, compare that to about 0.7% of residents in Clay County would be subject to that higher fourth tier tax bracket. I think the benefits, and I think that really just touches on what the legislature has done for greater Minnesota, and certainly what the legislature has done for Moorhead in the last year.
Okay, we've got a couple questions about things that probably aren't in your purview, but here's one that's kind of interesting. What can you do or what are you doing to address the issue of federal spying on Minnesota citizens? There's been a lot of concern lately, of course, about the NSA. Does the state have any way to talk to the feds about that?
I think some things the state can do is to put restrictions. I know there something folks have been talking about in the legislature are just for example like cameras on stoplights and things, and so how long law enforcement can retain that information, coming down certainly from, I think, something like 180 days coming down to 90 days or 60 days or something like that. So there certainly are things that the state can do in terms of data privacy, what type of information becomes public, how long certain information is held. So I think those are some things that the state would be able to do.
But again, strictly state-related issues. There's nothing you can do about it. Okay. All right. All right. I think we're about out of time. We have some redundant questions here and some we won't be able to get to, but I'm sure the gentleman will stick around for a few minutes in case you have a specific thing that you didn't hear here. So I want to thank, first of all, our senator and representatives for coming. Let's give them a big hand. We appreciate you guys being accessible. I know in all my years of working in broadcasting, covering news stories, I've found that legislators here on both sides of the river, Moorhead and Fargo, and both on a state and national level, have always been extremely accessible to people, and I think that's important. It isn't the same in every state. It's not so easy to get to see your lawmakers in some places, so we thank you for that. We appreciate that. It's good for all of us, I think, all citizens. Thanks again to the League of Women Voters for putting on this forum and all the good work they do when it comes to information like this, and then also candidate forums. I know you've got some coming up. And then, again, thanks to the library, the Lake Agassiz Regional Library, for hosting us here today. And thank you all for coming. Have a good weekend.